Welcome to Shapes of Grief, everybody. I am delighted this week to be joined by Julia Samuel from the UK. And Julia has written a beautiful book on grief called Grief Works. Julia, you're very welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me onto your important podcast. I'm delighted to be here.
So, Julia, I've known your name over the years associated with somebody who presents a lot about grief and talks about grief. You now have this lovely book, which is like it's like the Yalom of grief, if you like, for any psychotherapist listening. And it tells important stories, but grounded in theory. That's what I love about your book. You know, you mention all the recent theorists or the contemporary theories of grief. And I think this is really important because a lot of people, when they think of grief, they think immediately of the 5 stages of grief. And as listeners of this podcast will know, that was never meant to be for grief in the first place. But what people don't know is the more contemporary models, what they are and how they might apply to my grief, you know, for anybody listening in. So I'd love to take advantage of your wisdom and knowledge around this area, Julia, and speak a little bit about some of those contemporary theories.
I mean, I think I agree with Kubler-Ross is the only one that's known. And I think why people hold on to it is that because grief is invisible and everything is so intangible, people want a kind of concrete framework to hold on to make sense for themselves an experience that can feel crazy making. And I think the contemporary theories like Strobe and Shute, you know, the dual process, are incredibly helpful because they're not step by step, they're much more experiential. And what they talk about is that at the moment of the loss, whatever the loss is, it may be death, but it may be the end of a relationship by divorce, that all of us universally across the world have 2 instinctive responses: restoration orientation, where you want to get on and be okay and survive, and loss orientation, which is to emote and grieve and feel the pain of the loss. And that we oscillate, we naturally move between the 2, that if we allow ourselves to remember and grieve and feel the pain in loss orientation, we then will naturally spring to restoration orientation, where we can go for a walk with a friend, watch a movie, have a break from the pain, and give us energy to go back and do the loss work. What they also say is that men tend to be restoration oriented. Men tend to want to move on and survive and get going, to be restorative. And women tend to be loss oriented. They have this sort of Sherlock Holmes heat-seeking missile obsession with what's happened and go over every aspect of it, and also hold on to the emotions of it. I mean, you can certainly get women that are like men and men that are like women, but in relationships that can cause a real clash. If she thinks he's not feeling enough and he's cold and just moving forward, and he finds her very kind of upsetting and distressing, seeing her so upset all the time.
Yeah. And I think, you know, like you say, it's important to note that most men are instrumental grievers and some women are, and most women are intuitive grievers and some men are. And where we can run into trouble is where they don't understand each other. And they don't understand each other's process. You know, some instrumental grievers might think, come on, just get on with it. What's done is done. This has happened. We must get on with our lives. And some intuitive grievers may look at their partner and think, you know, why does he or she just get on with it? And how can they even think about building the extension? And this can cause trouble in relationships.
Yes, and I think understanding that this is a natural response that we're wired for, you know, as well as influenced by our culture and our family background and our backgrounds. And I think if couples just understand that men tend to be kind of more getting on, planning, looking forward, women tend to be more loss focused, that can help them be empathic and not so judgmental and angry with each other, think each other's doing it wrong. And what I suggest to couples is, and within a family system, because within a family, every member of the family can grieve slightly differently, is for them to give each other the opportunity to do a bit of the both. So it can be like a seesaw. If he sits with his partner as a woman and allows her to talk, and he just reflects back what he understands her to say and the emotion, and then he can create up an opportunity for her to come out and go for a walk with him, to kind of have a little glimmer of hope for the future, not make concrete plans, and so that they can help each other do a bit of the other and go through this process, moving in and out together rather than in and out against each other.
Absolutely. And I think also both sides are really important. Like, it is really important to grieve. It's really important to meet your grief and feel your grief, because actually that's really where the healing is. And it's also important to take a break from it and go for a walk and meet with a friend and talk about something else. We need both sides.
Yeah.
Have this lovely oscillation between both. Interesting, Julia. I had Robert Niemeyer on the program a few months ago, and they did some research on what sort of help bereaved people want and need. And, we do often think, oh, it's the emotional help and someone who can show up and be present, and that is vital. But it's no less important than the person who takes the children out, brings the dog for a walk, cooks the dinner. And in fact, the research that he quoted shows that bereaved people were actually more appreciative of the instrumental help, the really practical help, more so than the emotional help, which I thought was very interesting.
That is interesting. I think that is because they their life stopped and froze at the point that the person died, or they had the news that they were going to die. And seeing someone help them continue their life moving forward just by putting lasagna on the table or taking the children to school helps them feel a little bit more alive when they feel like they've died. So it kind of role models hope for them when they can't have it for themselves.
Yeah. And you're so vulnerable when you're bereaved, when you're grieving. You're so vulnerable. The thoughts of getting up and making a dinner and doing the practical things that you normally do can be really hard, really out of reach. And to have someone just swoop in and do that for you is really such a lovely support.
So, and to do it for a bit longer than the first sort of weeks. I mean, that's the difficulty. Is often people kind of give you what they feel is the right amount of time, whether it's a month, 3 months. And grief, as you well know, is an erratic process that can take a really long time.
Absolutely. And I think some people look in on grief, the grief of others, as an event in their lives. This is an event that happened in March 2013. But for that person, this is a new way of life, learning to live with my grief and accommodate to this massive loss that has happened. We don't get better, we don't get over it. We just learn to carry it. I'd love you to talk a little bit about the tasks of mourning. And these are not linear stages. These are tasks of mourning that another theorist, Warden, came up with.
And in a way, your word accommodation is the right word. So the tasks of mourning are what he talked about, how we find a way of living with a new reality that we don't want to be true, but we have no choice. And that in order to find a way of living and loving again, we need to face the reality of it. And then again, find our new selves that is going to be adapted and changed by the loss. And so what he talks about is that the first task of mourning is to face the reality of the loss and kind of really look at it. And for that, you really need a focus of memories. You need memories of both the death and the life. So often children, but also all of us, find the idea of seeing someone that's died or facing the reality of a dead person or the funeral very daunting. But unless we have a concrete memory that lets us know in a way that we can't not know it, that this person has died, we're in sort of denial because we're in la la land. We remember them alive. We have no visual image to let us know that they're really dead. So having the task of mourning is to face the reality of it. And as we say, look at the picture of the person that's died or remember them as they've died, we feel the loss of it. And as we feel the loss of it, we incrementally adjust a little bit more to this new reality. And as we do that, we sort of inch by inch adapt a bit more to where we are now. And the last task is that we have a way of living and loving again, having adapted through the process. And very much in the same frame as Strobe and Shoot, this isn't, as you say, a step by step, but that you move in and out of it. But the tasks are very important. And 15% of all psychological disorders come from unresolved grief, grief that hasn't been processed. So this is an important understanding that the things that we do to avoid the pain of loss are often the things that do us harm in the end, and often in families for generations. So the greater we understand that, as difficult as it is, and as much as we want to avoid it, how we heal in grief is by allowing ourselves to feel the pain.
It's you're making me think of childbirth, Julia. You know, I remember a certain point I decided, I think I was 10 centimeters dilated, and I decided, no, I don't actually want to do this anymore. And it's that moment of knowing the only way to the other side, you know, is to push and feel this, you know. And it takes tremendous courage, but it is so important. It is one of those paradoxes. The only way to heal from grief is to feel it. And that can be very painful when it's so overwhelming.
It's incredibly painful, and it's the absolute thing that you don't want it to be. But also in the way of childbirth, it is normal. You know, we have this amazing mechanism as human beings to feel, to have thoughts, to be sentient beings, which then gives us this amazing capacity to adapt and change. You know, we're evolutionarily wired to change. And it's only sort of 21st century that we think we can order and perfect our lives to make them as tidy as a Marie Kondo drawer, when, you know, lives are messy and they are not in our control. These fundamental aspects of life that matter to us more than anything else, life and death, fundamentally we have no control over. We can influence them by our, you know, how we behave and how we live, but fundamentally we have no choice. And to recognize that this is normal and organic, and that the key is to find our own ways of supporting ourselves to do the birth of it, to rebirth ourselves to this new normal, to this new version of ourselves, then we can embrace our life again. And you know, one of the most difficult aspects of grief that I talk a lot about in my book is that often in the fury, in the rage that the person has died, we turn against ourselves and we attack ourselves. And, you know, all the research shows that those that do best in grief, or those who have the best outcomes, are those that are self-compassionate and have support and love and connection to others at the time of the loss and following the loss. And love, you know, when love dies, it's love that we need, love for ourselves and the love of others.
Yeah, I love that. I've actually just done a 2-day training with Chris Germer, who's developed self-compassion, and he's going to come onto the podcast to talk about self-compassion in times of grief. This is another one of these, moving on. This is another paradox in grief, is the sense of, I lost my train of thought there. I'll edit this out in a second. Yeah, one of the paradoxes of grief is the notion of we need love to get through it. Actually, is there a lovely quote at the beginning of your book that I came across? There is no love without pain, but only love can heal that pain which it causes, by Father Julio Lancelotti. I don't know if I've pronounced that correctly. And it is this notion of it's other people, the love of other people in our lives, the connection from others and our community, our family, our friends, is really the best antidote to grief. However, for many of us, maybe with a poor attachment style, or, we've had issues of trust in our lives, the last thing we want to do when we're in pain is to step outside our front door. And I hear this of people who've had significant bereavements and their life completely shrinks. And they don't seem to have the capacity to reach out and pull in the help that they need. What would you say, Julia, to somebody who is feeling really isolated, really lonely, doesn't feel like anybody gets them or understands, and doesn't feel like they have the resources out there available to them? What can that person do to find resources in themselves?
I mean, there's obviously a very big, complicated answer, and I'll try and give a simpler one as I can. First of all, that the level of the loss is equal to the level of the love. So if the person has died, is everything in your life, and you don't have multiple other relationships or things that are meaningful to you, then you are looking at an enormous chasm. And while that person died, or when that person died, they also broke your trust in life and your trust in your capacity to find a purpose in life and a meaning in life if they were everything. And but I think we also do have this innate sense of survival and healing. So what I would suggest to someone who is kind of feeling incredibly isolated, very angry, is to do both. To kind of, part of the difficulty is by holding on to the pain, the person that's died can feel closer, and you can feel like you're abandoning them when you even begin to even contemplate letting yourself not feel the pain so much. So I think the things that help are not thinking things, are physical things. Grief is very embodied. What I would suggest someone to do is to get outside, breathe in the air, go for a walk, maybe step into a church or any other kind of beautiful building, light a candle, do something that feels meaningful to them, go to a park, have small things like a nice cup of coffee in a cafe, buy some flowers on your way home, do things, because we're so complex in our head, we keep kind of solve things. But if you do small bite-sized chunks of self-kindness, that can help you just lower the level of the pain enough then to have a little bit of hope, because in the end, it is hope that we're going to be okay, and that we can see a little bit of light that will mean you ring a friend and say, can you come around and have a cup of soup with me? Will you watch a movie with me? And then from there, you begin to turn the dial in a slightly more positive way.
Mm. I think also we do feel terribly alone and isolated in grief. But for most of us, or many of us, there is someone there. We're just not thinking of them. We're lost in our pain, and we're just not remembering the person who said and meant it, please call me, or I'll come over. And it could be helpful for people to write out a list of resources they have in their life and stick it on the fridge. Write down the people that if I were to call them, I would get a positive response and they would be able to be with me in my grief, or even just make me a dinner. So it's good for all of us, grieving or not, to be able to identify the resources in our lives that recharge us and can carry us through difficult times.
I think that's a really lovely point. And also to be aware of the sort of what I call the shitty committee, the messages we're saying to ourselves in our head. Nobody understands, nobody cares, I'm alone, this is as bad as it gets, I'm never going to get better. And to try and sort of dial that down, turn the tape off, and do exactly as you say, do something that does connect to someone, because we all do have someone.
Yeah. And I think you're reminding me there of something Brene Brown said. And she said, I don't remember her exact words, but she basically said, if you're looking for disapproval in the world, you will find it. And if you're looking for approval in the world, you will find it. They're not her words. And I don't remember, the words she used, but if you look for support in the world, you will find it. And if you look for the people who aren't available, you'll find them too. So, we have to ask ourselves, what am I looking for? What am I actually calling in here? I want to quote from your book again, Julia. You say, we must find a way of living with a reality that we don't want to be true. And grief is full of these paradoxes. And I think sometimes in life we go, it's either this or that. It's black or white, it's gay or straight. There's a spectrum of possibilities always in everything. And I think grief is no different. You're neither grieving nor okay. You're both wrapped up into one. And there's something, I think it's Pauline Bost. She talks a lot about ambiguous loss. And she mentions this notion of being able to hold the paradox can really help us have both exist between, inside us. I'm really hurting. I don't want this to be true. And it is true. And I'm going to be okay.
And that what I talk about in my theory of the paradox of grief is that if you hold the paradox and you hold them lightly side by side, then you can allow both to have their place and their time and their voice. But I think often, and partly in the pain and the fury, we try and knock one out with the other one. That this can't be true, I don't want it to be true. And then you knock out the kind of possibility of, I'm going to find a way of living with this. And that there's so many paradoxes, that the person that's died is no longer with us, and yet the love never dies, and that's very much alive inside us, and that continues through life. So how do we give ourselves permission to, on the one hand, face the reality that you're not going to touch them or see them or speak to them in their face ever again, and at the same time that everything that you do will be influenced by this person that you love, that you'll ask them out loud or in your mind, should I wear this pink shirt, or is this the nice man for me, or should I take that job? That they are very much, influencing you and shaping you as you go forward with your life. And you can hold these paradoxes in many different aspects and domains of grief.
And that leads us beautifully into continuing bonds, which was class, isn't that right?
Yeah, class.
Theory. So would you speak? Sorry.
Well, I think we keep interrupting each other. I think particularly from the 70s and 80s, we have this kind of very kind of rigid, you do one thing starts, then it ends, and then it starts. And people talk about closure and endings and moving forward. And in a way, what we've been saying all through this podcast is that nothing is ever as linear as stopped and started, and that continuing bonds is what Klaas talked about, is that the relationship continues and lives and even thrives. And what I talk about is doing that through touchstones to memory, so that you kind of encourage and embellish that continuing bond by having your own kind of suite of memories, SUITE, whether it's making your mum's chicken casserole, whether it's wearing your dad's big baggy jersey, whether it's going for a walk and talking about the person that's died, whether it's going to the grave, or whether it's planting a tree that you can visit, that you create touchstones to memory. I mean, someone said to me yesterday, every time I land at Heathrow, I used to ring my dad, and now I look at his picture on the phone as I walk through Heathrow. And so that's a comforting thing. I mean, for a long time, it was a painful thing, but now it's, oh, there's Dad. So in a way, what before is painful, over time becomes a warmth and a connection and a resource.
I think that's a really lovely point. A lot of our suffering, apart from the not grieving, which can cause suffering, is trying to find them. Where are they? Where is their essence? Where is their spirit? And for a lot of people, they can find that connection when they do manage to incorporate them somehow. And I was taking notes just before this podcast, listening to you talk, and you say it's by remembering them that we incorporate them inside us. And I just noticed that word incorporate. It's got corps, CORP, the French word for body.
Nice.
And there is a sense of how do we embody our loved one. I remember Thich Nhat Hanh was in Ireland a few years ago, and he was talking about grief, and he obviously was very attached to his mother. And he said the way he found to maintain a bond with her was to take his hand when he was feeling low and to put it on his forehead, and to know that his hand was imbued with her DNA that he had received from her. And he would just put his hand on his forehead, and for him, it would become his mother's hand, long after she had died. And this, all these little things that we can do to incorporate our deceased loved ones, like really find them in our heart rather than looking for them externally.
Faith, believe they're in heaven, or, if you're spiritual, that you believe that they're in the air and the essence of the world around you. I mean, I think it's, where you find them can be multiple and varied. Somebody said to me the other day, I folded him into my heart, which I thought was a kind of lovely, gentle way of saying it. But you're right. We death robs us of the future that we wanted with the person that's died, but the relationship never dies. The love always continues.
Yeah. And it's an important part of grieving is the making meaning and finding a narrative, for our loss. My last podcast guest, Helen Bohan, she told her brother died in a drowning accident, a boating accident, and she talks about in time finding him in the whales. There was a pod of whales where the boat had gone down, and another story of whales came up a few years later. So for her, the ocean is where her brother is, and the whales are the meaning of his spirit being at peace now,
Julie, can I add one more thing? Is that in a way we're talking about where there's uncomplicated relationships, where there isn't massive regrets, where there's not a lot of complexity and difficulty in the relationship when the person was alive. And of course, that is by no means the case, that a lot of people die leaving those bereaved behind, whether it's the circumstances, if it's by suicide or some traumatic death, or because you've had a very difficult relationship. And then in a way, you need to grieve both. You have to grieve the relationship you wished you could have had with that person and that now is forever gone, because always there's that hope I am going to get the mother, partner, father, sibling that I wanted. And then you have to grieve, how they died, the regrets, and then find a way of accommodating and living with it. So it is a much more complex mourning. And I think in those griefs, those are very difficult to do alone. Those I would suggest that you do need the support of, a volunteer or some professional who can really help you navigate these very contradictory, difficult feelings and stories.
It's another great point, Julia. And prolonged grief and complicated grief therapy is one area that I would work in. And contrary to what we might think, it's not always the really secure, close bonds that end up becoming a prolonged grief or a complicated grief. Like you say, it's often where there was a regret or there was an ambiguous relationship or a lot of conflict. So it's back to that lovely expression of, don't go to bed in an argument, so important. Back to our theories. Attachment and the work that John Bowlby would have done over the years, not just in grief, but John Bowlby talked a lot about attachment and how our attachment style can reflect how we grieve. And then I think it was Colin Murray Parkes, who you mentioned in your book, continued on Bowlby's work. Would you speak a little bit about attachment and grief and how that may manifest our attachment style? I realize that's a really broad subject I'm asking you to summarize in a few phrases, but take your time.
Well, I mean, how I understand it in its most kind of basic form is that how we learn to love and connect to others, we learn from our primary first relationships, from the adults around us. And that so if we learn that we can trust and we have secure attachment, that when we're upset or when we're happy, we have someone who will mirror that in us and soothe us and pick us up or play with us, that gives us a basic trust in life and a basic trust in ourselves and others, so that we look at other people not as a threat or as someone who's going to hurt us or someone who's difficult, but as someone who's going to respond to us. And we are confident about that. And insecure attachment, of which there are, different versions, is when that is fragmented, where you can't reliably look at another person because of that initial primary relationship and be confident that they're going to respond, that they might abandon you, they might impose themselves and their feelings on you, many of the different ways that we relate. And that as adults, we then have a default mode of coping when there's any difficulty. And that springs up in us faster than any of our thinking or our kind of logic. You can never put logic through an emotional system. So that if we have had an early insecure attachment with our parents, that will influence the people who we have relationship with, but also how we relate to them in love and in loss. And it will play out in both.
Yeah. I had a little child recently say to me that when his dad was alive, he was very close to his dad. He was talking about proximity, not emotionally. I was always beside him. And when he was dead, everybody else was beside him and I was far away.
Lovely.
And it made this was just the other day, and I knew I was meeting you, and it made me think about your relationship, your very good friend, Lady Diana, who died a number of years ago, and how that must have been for her children when they were with their mother and close to their mother, and then the whole world was involved when she died, and how that must have been for them. One thing I love about this podcast, Julia, is it's such a leveler. Grief affects everybody. It affects everybody. And I think Harry and William have done a great justice to our common humanity in recent years by speaking about their grief and their unresolved grief. One would assume there'd be an assumption that people with access to money and support would have all the right supports there, but it doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter who you are. Grief is grief, and not everybody gets a chance to have a loving presence help them through grief. And I'd love you to talk a little bit about, like Harry and William and many, many other people in the world, adults who were bereaved as children and weren't supported appropriately in their grief. How can they address it now? I mean, it is never too late. If it's 20, 30, 40 years later, it is never too late to go back and, have that ritual or that conversation or something that can help you to accommodate that thing that's not quite settled in you. Would you speak a little bit about that?
So in my book, I wrote a case study about Max, whose mum was killed when he was 3 years old. And as is very common, all photographs of her, all her clothing, everything about her was removed. And his dad had a new relationship with another woman. They moved country, and his mother was never talked about. And by the time I saw him, he had a lot of very sort of damaging behaviors with drugs, with women, with sex, with how he rode his bicycle. And it was really like he had this enormous sort of chasm inside him, and he was trying to fill it with anything that would anesthetize the pain. But actually, as we discovered over time, it was a mother-shaped hole. And the work for him to do was to find a way of connecting and having a memory of his mother, which of course is 3 he didn't have. So he again went on a sort of Sherlock Holmes mission to her siblings, to his godparents, to friends of hers, finding photographs, letters, stories, and he built up this wonderful kind of archive. And he was given a shirt of hers and a scarf and a handbag. So again, he began to build sort of touchstones to her memory, and he could find a way of both having him inside her, which allowed him then to grieve her death, which he'd never had the opportunity to do.
Having her inside him.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And as he kind of had an image for her, he could feel the pain of her death, and he could also find a way of connecting and loving her and feel that she was guiding him in his present and his future. And, you know, and that I've said that in a couple of minutes. This was a long haul. It's a complicated process of going forward, moving backwards, jumping back in the hole. But he really got there in the end. It was a very lovely piece of work.
Okay. And that's in your book, Grief Works, for anybody listening. Pick up this book. I'm really aware that we're coming to the end of our time together, Julia, but I just want to look at one more thing. Grief is hard work, and I think you mention, I don't know if it's in one of your presentations, it may be in the book as well, grief works, but it's hard. And that's a quote by Freud. When we talk about grief, what does it look like? You know, we talked earlier about how we sanitize everything, and it makes it very hard then when we're faced with the chaos of childbirth or death or grief, because we don't see it out there. We're living in a sanitized world. Would you describe, I mean, I know what grief looks and feels like, my own grief. It's very messy. And would you describe for anybody listening, what's normal? You know, wailing, crying, lots of snot. I mean, what can we talk about what grief looks like and feels like, just to not be doing a sanitized podcast, you know?
I mean, you're right, is that one of the things is the feelings are invisible. And so, you know, one of the images I use is that an iceberg, if the third above the iceberg is the face that you see that is not looking, walking, wounded, but the 2/3 below the waterline are the part where the pain and the sense of like you've got a limb missing or a big chasm in your being is going on. And really the work is finding a way of expressing what's below the waterline, above the waterline, so that it can kind of release you. And that is in many different ways. You know, it can be snotty, wailing, crying, thumping pillows, you know, fury, punching. And it can be very silent. It can be with music. It can be journaling. It can be through prayer. It can be through gardening. The key is that we have to find our own particular way of expressing our grief. So the thing that is universal is that we need to find a way of expressing our grief. And that is paradoxically how we heal. How we do it is unique to how we've been brought up, what works for us. You know, I think the thing about talking is that it makes what is inchoate and kind of invisible in your being, it gives it a narrative and a story where you connect the words with your feeling and you see them land on the person opposite you. And that helps shift something in your system. But there are, you know, certainly Penny Baker shows that research that journaling is as effective as talking. So there are many ways of expressing grief. The thing I'd like to mention is my app.
Yeah, great.
That's okay. So I've developed a 30-day app, which at the moment is it's free. It's on trial with the company that I did it with, and it's really they've kind of dug into my book and taken all the lessons and the stories and the theories and my voice and my words and developed it into 30 sessions. So for someone who can't afford or doesn't have time to go to a therapist, is scared of talking to someone, this is a very, very good way into themselves. Each session takes about half an hour. So it's not a huge time commitment. And of course, the 30 days you can do over 90 days, or you can do it every day. And that's at www.griefworks.app. But it's also on my website, which you'll probably release with the podcast.
I will indeed. And that's a lovely gift that you're giving out, Julia. Is it available immediately?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Because I know
I'll get it immediately, yeah.
A couple of weeks ago, I signed up to be notified about it. So I'll check back in there. And
because you'll have the trial for it. I thought they'd release that now, but maybe they haven't.
Okay, we'll check that anyway, and we'll put a link to it. And just when you're saying there, Julie, about the importance of expressing our grief, we can feel grief emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally, and for some we'll find, mentally expressing it or verbally is how we will get through it. For others, it'll be emotional. For others, it'll be physical. Like you say, find the way to express your grief and to process it in a way that works for you.
And it may be all of those.
And it may be all of those for a good integration of it. Well, Julia, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for your time. I'll put a link to your book. It's available on your website as well, is it? As well as Amazon and everywhere. We'll definitely link to the app. And congratulations on what you've achieved. It's wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I'm delighted that this app will be there for people who can't afford grief therapy. It's expensive. All of this helps.
And thank you for kind of raising awareness and understanding of grief. You and I are absolutely singing the same song on the same song sheet, is that the more understanding people have and the more awareness there is in the world, then grief doesn't need to be made worse by ignorance and by lack of support. And I hope everyone that is listening find ways of being self-compassionate and looking after themselves so that they can find a way of accommodating their circumstance. All those of friends and family. I think the other thing is that you have secondary feelings of grief, don't you, when you're with someone who you care about, who's grieving, and they sort of ping feelings into your body, because it's very physical. And so for them too, you're very, very important to those around you. So take care of yourselves.
Yeah, it's a very tender time when we lose someone we love, and it needs to be met with love.
Lovely. Yeah. Nice
Thanks,
to meet
Julia. You. Lovely to meet you.
Bye.